Have you ever felt like you were trapped, not knowing how to move forward? As if something invisible was blocking your victories and making you feel powerless? Maybe you've experienced a sense that, despite your efforts, evil seems to be closing in, trying to take away your peace, your confidence, and even your purpose. This happens when the bonds of evil try to tie themselves to our lives, keeping us imprisoned in difficulties, anxieties, and obstacles that seem impossible to overcome. But there is a powerful truth you need to know. You are not alone, and there is a prayer that can break these bonds, destroying everything that tries to imprison you. Psalm 35 is a deeply strong and powerful prayer, capable of invoking God's power to break any chain of evil, destroy the barriers that keep us from moving forward, and bring clarity and divine protection into our lives. This prayer is not just words, it is a direct cry for divine protection against all evil and injustice. When you recite Psalm 35, you are asking for divine intervention, for the forces of evil to disperse, and for the bonds that imprison you to be broken. You may have faced blockages, invisible enemies, or situations that seem impossible to resolve, but with Psalm 35, you have a powerful weapon in your hands. It brings with it the promise that God hears the righteous and answers with power, bringing protection, deliverance, and the strength needed to face any adversity. At this moment, you might be wondering, how can something so simple be so powerful? The answer lies in faith and in God's power. Psalm 35 is a call for divine action, and anyone who invokes it with sincerity and faith will see the transformative results in their life. No matter the size of the evil you face, with this prayer, you can be sure that the bonds will be broken and freedom will be restored. Prepare to discover how this prayer can be the key to your liberation. You won't believe what it can do for you, but the truth is that when you use it with faith, transformation will be real. Dear brother, dear sister in Christ, have you ever felt the weight of these difficult times? It seems like the world is increasingly overwhelmed by wars, hunger, pain, and uncertainties. Every day, we become more aware that there is only one solution: turning to our Heavenly Father with all our heart. I know it's not easy. Sometimes, you may feel lost, as if you're lacking direction or strength to face the challenges. That's exactly why I've created something special for you. My ebook Prayers from the Psalms, Strengthen Your Faith Daily. This book is more than just words. It is a spiritual guide that will help you find peace, renew your faith, and feel closer to God, even on the darkest days. With almost 150 pages filled with powerful prayers and transformative reflections, you will have a resource to maintain a daily connection with the Father, strengthening your faith and bringing light to your journey. And here's a warning. This book is available for a limited time. Many are already finding the strength they needed in it, and soon it may be taken down. Don't miss this opportunity to transform your spiritual life. Click now on the link in the first pinned comment and secure your copy. Remember, each day is a chance to get closer to God and live in His presence. Psalm 35 is one of the deepest and most emotional prayers in the Bible, written by King David at a time of great need and anguish. This psalm reveals the heart of someone who, despite facing adversities, fully trusts in God's justice and power to intervene in situations of danger and persecution. It is a sincere and intense cry for protection, justice, and divine defense. David, known as a man after God's own heart, was no stranger to conflict and injustice. He faced enemies who sought to destroy him, people plotting against him, and situations where betrayal and evil seemed to prevail. In Psalm 35, he addresses God as his heavenly lawyer, asking the Lord to fight his battles and confront those who persecute him unjustly. It's as if David is saying, "Lord, only you can bring justice where man fails." This psalm is not only a plea, but also a declaration of faith. David acknowledges that, no matter how great the strength or number of his enemies, God is sovereign and just, capable of reversing any situation. He asks that God confound the plans of his adversaries, disarm them, and prevent them from continuing their cruel acts. There is a direct appeal for divine intervention, where he cries out, "Contend, Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me." Psalm 35 verse 1. Beyond seeking personal protection, David shows a concern for truth and justice. He does not desire vengeance for the sake of vengeance, but that truth prevails, that injustice is corrected, and that wrongdoers are exposed. For David, victory is not just escaping danger but seeing God's name glorified as the great defender of those who trust in him. This psalm is particularly powerful for those facing difficult situations, whether interpersonal conflicts, persecution, or spiritual challenges. It teaches that, when we feel surrounded by enemies or problems, we can turn to God as our faithful defender. It encourages us to place our battles in the hands of the Lord, trusting that He knows exactly how to act, when to act, and why to act. With words full of emotion and trust, Psalm 35 reminds us that God is not indifferent to our pain. He sees injustice, hears the cries of His people, and acts on behalf of those who surrender to His will. This psalm is a powerful expression of faith and an invitation for each of us to place our struggles in the hands of the God who never fails. God is not someone who simply watches our struggles from afar, without getting involved. He is our mighty warrior, always ready to intervene and fight in our place. In Psalm 35, David presents us with this impressive image of God as an active defender, someone who takes our battles upon himself and acts with incomparable justice and power. When we feel weak or incapable of dealing with life's challenges, we can remember that God is by our side, not as a spectator, but as a strong and reliable commander. He calls us to trust Him fully, to place our struggles and anxieties in His hands, because He knows exactly what to do. The opening verse of Psalm 35 is a clear example of this. Contend, Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Here, David cries out for God's intervention as a warrior who does not retreat but faces the enemies head-on. When we think of God as our warrior, we realize that He not only protects but also guides and strengthens. He does not leave us alone in the storm. Rather, He fights for us, gives us courage, and reminds us that in Him we are more than conquerors. This is a powerful truth for times when we feel overwhelmed by difficulties. Psalm 35 teaches us that our battles, whether spiritual, emotional, or physical, do not have to be faced with our own strength. When we place our problems in God's hands, He takes the lead, dismantling traps, confusing enemies, and giving us the peace that only He can offer. This concept of God as warrior also highlights that the fight is not just ours, it's His. Therefore, when we face situations of injustice or attacks, we must trust that God knows how to fight better than we do. He does not act impulsively or with human mistakes but with divine wisdom. He disarms enemies, knocks down barriers, and opens ways where there seemed to be no exit. Seeing God this way changes our perspective completely. Instead of being paralyzed by fear or a sense of defeat, we rest in the certainty that He is working for us. Just like David, we can cry out with confidence, "Let my soul rejoice in the Lord, let it be glad in His salvation." Psalm 35 verse 9. Therefore, Psalm 35 encourages us to place our hope in the God who fights for us, reminding us that we are not alone. He does not just observe, He acts. He does not only comfort us, He protects us and leads us to victory. The only thing we need to do is trust, leave the battles in His hands, and wait in faith for His action. The verses of Psalm 35 are filled with powerful images that highlight God's intervention in times of danger and oppression. When David says, "Let those be ashamed and brought to confusion who seek my life. Let them turn back and be ashamed who wish me evil," Psalm 35 verse 4, he reveals his total dependence on God. This cry reflects the heart of someone who understands that true justice does not come from human hands, but from the Lord. In this verse, the shame and confusion that David asks for his enemies are more than feelings. They represent the destruction of their evil plans. David is not asking for a simple deliverance, but for God Himself to expose the futility of his pursuers' intentions. The idea of confusion shows that those who conspire against the righteous will meet their downfall before achieving their goal. It is a powerful declaration that evil does not prevail against those who trust in the Lord. When He declares, "Let them be like chaff before the wind, with the angel of the Lord driving them away," Psalm 35 verse 5, The metaphor used is profoundly significant. The chaff is light, powerless, and unable to resist the wind. It is an image of the fragility of all those who oppose God. Here, David shows that, no matter how powerful the enemies seem, in the presence of the divine, they become insignificant. The wind represents God's power, which relentlessly disperses them, and the angel of the Lord symbolizes God's direct action on behalf of his children. Another impactful passage is, "Let their way be dark and slippery, with the angel of the Lord pursuing them." Psalm 35 verse 6. Here, David paints a picture of complete chaos for his enemies. The dark way reveals how they will be plunged into darkness, unable to discern or proceed with their evil plans. Slippery indicates that any attempt to move forward will be thwarted, as they will find no support or firmness. This description reinforces that the struggle against the righteous will not only fail but will also bring despair to those who persist in evil. These passages not only describe God's intervention but also invite the reader to reflect on the trust we can have in Him. When we face challenges, persecution, or injustice, it is natural to feel fear or doubt. However, Psalm 3:5 reminds us that God does not remain indifferent to our struggles. He is active, present, and powerful enough to turn the tide in our favor, frustrating the plans of evil and protecting us as a shield. Another important detail in these passages is the mention of the angel of the Lord, who appears as God's messenger, fulfilling his purpose to protect and defend the righteous. It demonstrates that divine help is not only spiritual but also tangible. God sends his help at the right time and in ways we may not even perceive. This angelic presence emphasizes that even when we feel alone, there is a celestial force working on our behalf. Moreover, these verses carry an essential lesson about God's justice. David does not seek revenge with his own hands, but surrenders everything to the Lord, trusting that he alone is capable of perfect judgment. This teaches us to avoid the temptation of retaliating or seeking justice in our own way. Instead, we are called to trust in God, knowing that He sees everything and acts with wisdom and love on our behalf. Finally, the impactful passages of Psalm 35 remind us that God's power is always available to those who trust in Him. He is our refuge and fortress, a help in times of adversity. When we feel attacked, wronged, or surrounded by evil, we can turn to God with the same boldness as David, confident that the Lord will hear our cry and act with strength and justice on our behalf. In Psalm 35 verse 10, David asks a profound question full of gratitude. "Who is like you, Lord, who delivers the poor from the one who is stronger?" This statement reveals David's admiration for the greatness of God and his special care for the needy and vulnerable. David acknowledges that God is unique, there is no one like him, especially in how he cares for those in despair. This phrase of David reminds us that God is not indifferent to the suffering of the weak. He does not limit himself to helping the powerful or those with resources to defend themselves. On the contrary, he takes on the cause of the defenseless, those facing hardships, and, surprisingly, acts with power to deliver them from oppression and injustice. The psalmist highlights one of God's most precious characteristics, his impartial justice and his heart inclined to those who most need his intervention. When David speaks of the poor being delivered from the one who is stronger, he refers to the fact that, in many situations, the stronger, whether a person, a situation, or adversity, ends up oppressing the weak. However, God's response to this inequality is astonishing. He not only protects the weak but also rescues them with power and grace, overcoming forces that seem unbeatable. This passage is particularly comforting to all those who feel small, despised, or hopeless in the face of life's difficulties. If you feel powerless to fight against situations that seem insurmountable, Psalm 35 teaches us that God is on the side of the defenseless. He presents himself as the defender of those who, without him, would have no way to prevail. As a true liberator, he acts with mercy and power to rescue. And as we reflect on this, we understand that no matter how great the adversity, God never leaves his children helpless. When the weight of difficulties feels overwhelming, remember, God sees and hears the cry of those in need. He is ready to act and rescue. There is no battle too great or challenge so immense that he cannot overcome on our behalf. In the end, Psalm 35 is not only a prayer for deliverance but also an invitation to fully trust in God's sovereignty. He not only rescues but transforms the fate of the weak, making them victorious through him. This is a promise we can carry with us. God is attentive to our suffering and will not leave us alone in the fight. More than that, by experiencing his care and rescue, we are called to act in the same way, caring for the most needy around us, being instruments of his justice and mercy in the world. David, a man of great victories, also faced moments of immense suffering, and Psalm 35 gives us a glimpse into the depth of his trials. He was the target of betrayals, relentless attacks, and even mockery from people close to him, those he considered friends. But what stands out in this psalm is the way he dealt with these difficulties. Instead of succumbing to despair or revenge, David remained firm in his faith, keeping his eyes fixed on God, the only one capable of rescuing and restoring. It is remarkable to see how, despite false accusations and betrayals, David did not resort to personal vengeance. Instead, he turned to God in prayer. He cries out to the Lord, "Contend, Lord, with those who contend with me. Fight against those who fight against me." Psalm 35 verse 1. Here, we see the heart of David, who surrenders the battles to God, trusting that the Lord will fight for him and his cause. He knew that, even when the whole world was against him, God was his refuge, his strength, and his salvation. David did not limit himself to praying only for his own cause but also for others. In verse 13, he reveals an impressive aspect of his character. "When they were sick, I put on sackcloth and humbled myself with fasting." He fasted and prayed for others, even for those who persecuted him, with a sincere heart of compassion. David was not only concerned with his own suffering but also with the suffering of those around him. His selfless spirit is a powerful lesson on how we should treat others, especially when we are facing our own difficulties. True humility and Christian love are revealed when we can look beyond ourselves and intercede for others, even when facing personal storms. David's suffering did not drive him away from God. On the contrary, he used these experiences to draw closer to him. Constant prayer and dependence on God, especially in times of pain and uncertainty, were the keys that sustained David. He did not look to his own strength or abilities but knew that his true strength came from God. He trusted in God's power to fight for him, to defend his cause, and to bring justice where there was injustice. In Psalm 35, he places his trust entirely in God, demonstrating that when we are at rock bottom, only God can lift us up. The way David dealt with pain and suffering, and the way he interceded for others, even in the midst of his own adversities, gives us a model of Christian life. He teaches us that we should not seek revenge or try to solve our battles on our own. Instead, we should place our trust in God, pray, and ask for his divine intervention, knowing that he is faithful to help us. David also teaches us that, even when the pain seems unbearable, we can find comfort and strength in God, who deeply cares for us and sustains us in all circumstances. David's testimony is also a powerful reminder that our faith should not be shaken by the challenges we face. On the contrary, these moments of difficulty can be opportunities to grow in our trust in God and in our ability to love others. David, with his fervent prayer, intercession for others, and unwavering trust in God, shows us how, even in the midst of suffering, we can reflect the character of Christ in our lives, serving and loving others, and patiently waiting for God's intervention on our behalf. When we reflect on David's life, we are challenged to live a deeper faith, a faith that does not depend on circumstances but fully trusts in God, even when everything seems lost. David's example teaches us that, when facing difficulties, we can find strength not in our own ability, but in the divine strength given to us by God, and that He, in His mercy and love, will always be with us, every step of the way. In the midst of suffering and pain, when difficulties seem unbearable and injustice seems to dominate, a deeply anguished question arises on David's lips. "How long, Lord, will you look on?" This question is not a doubt about God's goodness, but an expression of the cry of someone who feels the weight of an apparently endless struggle. David, though facing attacks and betrayals, has full certainty that God, the righteous judge, will never ignore the suffering of his children. In times like these, when everything around us seems to be crumbling and injustice prospers, it is natural to question God's silence. However, David, even in his distress, does not give in to despair. On the contrary, he turns his gaze toward the Lord, with firm confidence that he is not distant but is working on behalf of his people. He knows that, however long and arduous the battle may seem, God is attentive to every detail and will respond at the exact moment. David's confidence is not in a distant God who watches difficulties from afar, but in a God who actively works to restore justice. In Psalm 35, he cries out, "Awake, Lord! Rise up to my defense, to my cause, my God and my Lord." David knows that God is not a passive spectator, but a warrior who intervenes in the hardest battles of his children. He trusts fully that, in due time, God will bring justice, bring it to light, and expose the unjust acts. This confidence of David should be an example for us. When we face difficult situations, when we feel persecuted or misunderstood, we may be tempted to take control of the situation on our own. But David teaches us that the best response is to trust in God's action, knowing that He, in His perfect justice, is always attentive and in control of everything. His justice never fails, and He will never cease to act on behalf of those who are His. Psalm 35 reminds us that God's justice is always the best solution, even when it seems delayed. Even in times of silence, God is working, and His response will come at the right time. Like David, we should cry out to Him, trusting that He is the only one capable of bringing justice in a true and perfect way. In the end, our trust in His action will bring peace and security, for He is faithful to fulfill all His promises. At the end of Psalm 35, David expresses deep gratitude and commitment to praise God publicly. He says, "I will praise you in the great assembly. Among the throngs I will exalt you." These words reveal an unwavering trust in God's power and faithfulness, even while he was still facing persecution and adversity. Praising Him in the great assembly is not just a simple promise of worship but a demonstration of faith in action, as David decides, even before seeing the resolution of his struggle, to thank and acknowledge God's sovereignty in all areas of his life. It is important to note that David does not wait for the end of the battle to celebrate. He chooses to praise God while still in the midst of the fight. This reflects his trust that God had already begun working in his life, and even though the victory was not immediate, he knew that God's hand was upon him. This kind of faith is deeply challenging because, as humans, we tend to expect difficulties to disappear before we express gratitude. But David teaches us that, even in adversity, we must recognize God's goodness and faithfulness, because He is worthy of being praised not only for moments of victory but also for the lessons and growth that come from the battles. When speaking of praise in the great assembly, David refers to a public moment of worship where he will proclaim what God has done for him, with the intention of encouraging others to trust in the Lord. Praise is not just a personal expression of gratitude, but also a way to testify to others about God's power and His intervention. When God gives us a victory, whether in an internal or external struggle, we have a duty to share that victory with those around us. This public testimony is a way to strengthen the faith of others, showing them that God acts faithfully in our lives and that He can do the same for them. This public praise also represents a reaffirmation of David's commitment to God. By saying that he would praise among the people, he shows his willingness not to hide his faith, but to proclaim it openly, in all situations and before all people. Praise is not something to be done only within the walls of a church or in moments of privacy. It is an expression of faith that should be shared with the world. David teaches us that the testimony of our faith must be audible and visible to all, because when we share what God has done in our lives, we can inspire others to also trust in Him. Furthermore, this act of public praise, before the congregation, strengthens not only David's own faith but also that of the community. When someone testifies to the greatness of God, others are built up and encouraged to look to Him with greater confidence. Our attitude of praising God publicly and in all circumstances also serves as a reminder that He is worthy to be celebrated, regardless of the situations we are facing. When we choose to praise God, we are declaring that, for us, He is greater than any adversity, and that His presence in our lives is the greatest of all victories. David knew that praise is a powerful tool for strengthening faith. He was not only celebrating the personal victories God had granted him, but also sharing that victory with the people of God, encouraging everyone to place their trust in the Lord. Public praise is not just an acknowledgement of what God has done, but a proclamation of who He is, a faithful, just, and merciful God who fights on our behalf and gives us victory. When we celebrate God's victories, we are doing more than expressing gratitude. We are proclaiming to the world that He is the sovereign Lord over all things. This praise is an act of testimony that strengthens our own faith and the faith of those around us, showing that, in any situation, God's victory is guaranteed. And, just like David, our life of worship can be a powerful witness to others, leading them to experience the same faith and trust we have in a God who never fails. In Psalm 35, David makes a bold and faith-filled request. Let those be ashamed and confounded who seek my life. He cries out to God to act on his behalf and bring justice against those who rejoice in his affliction. This passage reveals David's deep desire for divine justice to prevail over the injustices and attacks he faces. David is not seeking personal vengeance, but asking God to intervene, bringing His justice to light in the midst of adversity. This cry reflects David's heart, who, despite being the target of persecution and injustice, knew that only God had the power and authority to judge and correct the situations. He understood that God's justice never fails, and that, even when it seems the wicked prosper at the expense of the righteous pain, God will intervene with His mighty hand at the right time. David also makes a very specific request. He asks God to shame those who rejoice in evil, meaning those who wish for His downfall and take pleasure in others' difficulties. It is a plea for the Lord to humble and defeat David's enemies, who take delight in his pain. This part of the psalm is a call for God to expose the evil plans of His persecutors, bringing to light all the wickedness they try to hide. Thus, David places his trust not only in God's protection, but also in the fact that God's justice will be manifested and triumphant. This plea for vindication is not merely a desire for retribution. It is, in fact, a request for divine intervention that reveals the truth and brings a just end to evil. David knows that, ultimately, God is the supreme judge, and He has the final word over all situations. This trust in God as the righteous judge brings relief to the troubled heart, for David knows that, even amidst persecution, God will rescue him and show him the victory of His justice. David's prayer also serves as a reminder that, although we may be victims of injustices or false accusations, we should trust that God is attentive to all things. He does not ignore the suffering of the righteous, nor does He allow the wicked to prosper for long. His justice may seem delayed, but it is always perfect and arrives at the right time. David teaches us that we can and should bring our cries to God, asking Him to act justly, protect the innocent, and defeat those who rejoice in injustice. Additionally, the prayer for liberation and justice that David makes here encourages us to act similarly when facing difficulties. Instead of resorting to hatred or vengeance, we should seek God's justice and trust that He knows what is best for us. When we feel wronged, it is natural to want to defend our cause, but David's example shows us that the best course is to cry out to God, ask Him to intervene, and let Him take care of everything. This prayer for liberation and justice also teaches us the importance of trusting God to resolve issues that are beyond our control. We do not need to fight our battles alone or take justice into our own hands, because God is just and powerful enough to act on our behalf. Just like David, we can rest assured that, in the end, God will do what is right and bring liberation to those who seek Him. In Psalm 35, David makes a powerful declaration that reflects his absolute trust in God's faithfulness. Great is the Lord, who delights in the well-being of His servant. This verse highlights a fundamental truth. God is not only aware of our struggles, but He cares deeply for us and desires our well-being. Amidst a scene of persecution and distress, David confidently affirms that the Lord, the Creator of the universe, cares about what happens to him. He is not a distant God, indifferent to our pain, but an active defender who is involved in our lives and fights for us. By affirming that God delights in the well-being of his servant, David reminds us that, to God, we are not just nameless or insignificant people amidst the vastness of the world. To him, we are precious. He cares deeply about our lives, and in his greatness and power, he defends us. God is a defender who, in his majesty, does not abandon us but becomes our refuge and strength. The word delights conveys the idea of pleasure, satisfaction, and joy. God finds joy in caring for us, in protecting us, and guiding us. This is not something we earn, but something due to his unconditional love and faithfulness. When David makes this statement, he invites us to see God not as a distant judge, but as a father who is close, who cares, who fights battles with us and for us, with a zeal and care beyond our comprehension. This greatness of God as our defender is an immense comfort, especially when we are facing difficulties and injustices. Often, we feel that we are alone in the struggle, but Psalm 35 reminds us that, in all our battles, God is by our side. He has not left us helpless, and in his immense goodness, he intercedes for us, becoming our protector. He sees the injustice, hears our cry, and acts on our behalf because he cares deeply and truly for us. Furthermore, this passage is a reminder that when we are in battle, we can trust that God will take perfect care of us. He is not only a defender in times of distress, but he is also the one who delights in seeing us live in peace, safety, and prosperity. He fights for our well-being, not only in times of crisis but throughout our entire journey. When we face difficulties, we can remember that God delights in protecting and blessing those who are his. He is a faithful defender, always attentive to our needs. This verse calls us to rest in the confidence that, though we face adversity, we are not alone. God is with us, always ready to defend us and give us victory because he delights in caring for us, like a father cares for his children with all love and dedication. Psalm 35 is a profound song of thanksgiving, where David, amidst his struggles, acknowledges the greatness and faithfulness of God in his life. Throughout the psalm, we see a David who, even surrounded by enemies, does not fail to exalt God as his source of salvation and protection. His gratitude is not a simple or automatic response, but a deep reflection on God's care and how he has been a safe refuge in moments of danger and tribulation. David begins his prayer by thanking God for all the divine interventions that gave him victory over his adversaries. He speaks of how God delivered him from the hands of those who sought to destroy him, and how he rescued him from situations where there was no hope left. "You delivered me from death and made me live." David acknowledges that each rescue in his life was not just a physical deliverance, but an act of divine mercy. It was not something he deserved, but something that came because of God's love and faithfulness. In his gratitude, David does not limit himself to a simple "thank you." He expresses his thankfulness deeply, in actions and words, with a heart full of praise. He recognizes that the salvation of his life is not the result of his own effort or skill, but of God, who, in his sovereignty, chose to protect and rescue him. For David, this reality is the greatest reason for his thanksgiving. He understands that his protection and salvation were not mere accidents, but a reflection of God's goodness, which works in favor of those who trust in him. David's gratitude is also a testimony of humility. He does not forget that in his hardest moments, it was God who sustained him. Even when it seemed there was no way out, when the forces of opposition seemed greater than him, David knew his salvation came from God. He thanks God not only for what he has done, but for what he continues to do. God's intervention in his life is not something isolated or temporary. It is constant, a presence of care and protection in all moments of his journey. Furthermore, David understands that gratitude is not limited to the immediate moment of salvation, but extends to a continuous attitude of recognition and praise to God. He knew that God had always been faithful, not only in moments of triumph, but also in battles. David's gratitude is a response to a God who never abandoned him, who was always by his side, both in victories and defeats, in joy and in pain. This teaches us that true gratitude to God should be a constant attitude, not a reaction to specific moments of deliverance. David goes beyond simple verbal expressions of thanks. He makes a public commitment to praise God, acknowledging His greatness before all. "I will praise you in the great congregation." It is not a silent or reserved thank you. He wants everyone to see and hear what God has done for him. This is a powerful aspect of his gratitude. He does not keep to himself what God has done, but shares his experience of deliverance to inspire and strengthen the faith of others. This act of public praise is a testimony to God's power and an invitation for others to experience His goodness and faithfulness. This attitude of David is an example of how we should respond to God's intervention in our lives. When God delivers us, protects us, and gives us victory, our gratitude should not just be an internal feeling, but a visible and impactful action. We must be quick to recognize that everything we have, everything we are, comes from God. And as we express our gratitude sincerely and publicly, we not only strengthen our relationship with God but also positively influence those around us, showing them God's power and faithfulness. Finally, David's gratitude is also a recognition that, even when we face difficulties, God is working on our behalf. Even when we do not see immediate solutions or when we are in the middle of a storm, He is with us. True gratitude goes beyond the moment of deliverance. It extends into a deep trust that God will always be by our side, working for us, protecting us, and preparing us for what is to come. In Psalm 35, David not only expresses his gratitude but also a deep humility in recognizing his total dependence on God. In a moment of sincere reflection on his life and walk with God, he makes a deep cry, "Create in me a pure heart, O God." This prayer is not only a request for spiritual cleansing, but a recognition that, on his own, David is incapable of keeping himself pure and just. He knows that purity of heart and holiness come from God, and without His help, he could not achieve these goals. David's request is not isolated from his spiritual journey. It comes from a place of introspection and repentance, for David had already faced many failures in his life. As king and leader, he knew that his choices and actions affected not only himself but also the nation. This weight of responsibility made him realize even more that he depended completely on God to be restored and purified, for he knew his own efforts would not be enough to achieve this spiritual renewal. When David says, "Create in me a pure heart," he is not simply asking for forgiveness or the removal of his past failures. He is asking for a deep transformation, a radical change in his inner being. He desires a renewal that only God can provide. David knew that no matter how hard he tried to be faithful, the inclination of the human heart is often toward error, and only God could purify that heart and guide him on a path of righteousness. Moreover, this confession of dependence is a model for all of us. Often, when we face difficulties, we try to fight alone or seek solutions only with our strength and wisdom. However, David teaches us that true victory comes when we recognize our fragility and total need for God. When we are willing to admit that we can do nothing without His intervention, that our strength is limited and our wisdom is flawed, it is at that moment that God can truly work in our lives. David, in asking God for a pure heart, is also expressing his need for forgiveness. This request is a confession that he is not perfect and that he needs divine grace to be restored. The act of asking for forgiveness is a reflection of humility. David does not try to justify his actions but acknowledges his faults and turns to God seeking mercy. This desire for renewal and spiritual purity also reveals David's understanding of the nature of his relationship with God. For him, it was not just about following rules or obeying commandments, but about being in constant communion with the Lord. The desire for a pure heart was, for David, an expression of his longing for intimacy with God, to live according to His will, and to be transformed into His image. David exemplifies that this dependence is not something that occurs only in moments of crisis, but should be a continuous attitude. He does not expect to be self-sufficient but constantly seeks God's presence to guide his steps. He knows that true purification, true transformation, only comes through divine action. Therefore, Psalm 35 is an invitation for all of us to humble ourselves before God, recognizing that without Him we can do nothing, and that our dependence on Him is the key to true spiritual restoration. In a world that constantly encourages us to rely on our own strength, David reminds us of the importance of recognizing that our strength comes from God. By making this prayer, David teaches us that humility, the recognition of our limitations, and the desire to be purified by God are essential for spiritual growth. Dependence on God is the foundation for a life of faith, for only He can renew us and empower us to live according to His will. David's life was marked by a series of battles, betrayals, and deep trials, but through all these difficult moments, he never lost his trust in God. David faced immense challenges, from battles against powerful enemies like the giant Goliath to internal conflicts such as the intrigues and persecutions of King Saul himself. However, one thing that always stood out in David's life was his unwavering faith in God's power and protection. One of the most emblematic declarations he makes in times of distress, which still resonates deeply among the faithful today, is recorded in Psalm 35. "No weapon forged against me will prosper." These words are not just an empty statement, but a profound demonstration of trust in God's protection and sovereignty over all things. David was not ignoring the difficulties he faced. He was simply acknowledging that, no matter how powerful the enemy's weapons were, they would not prevail against God's will. Even if the adversary prepared with all his might, God was greater, and ultimately, He would control the outcome of the battle. By saying that no weapon forged against him would prosper, David was declaring his confidence in the constant presence of God in his life, especially in times of danger. He knew that, no matter how strong or cunning the enemy was, God was with him and would fight by his side. This doesn't mean David was immune to the attacks or sufferings of life. In fact, he faced many hardships, but his faith was grounded in the fact that God would not abandon him, no matter what happened. For David, true victory was not about defeating enemies with his own strength, but about trusting that the Lord, his defender, would take care of the situation. This trust in God also reflects a deep understanding of the nature of spiritual warfare. David knew that many of the battles he faced were not just physical, but also spiritual. The enemy that rose against him was often invisible to human eyes, but David knew that God had power over everything, both visible and invisible. When he proclaimed that no weapon forged against him would prosper, he was declaring that his faith was not in the strength of his own weapons, but in the strength of God, who is able to protect his children in any circumstance. David's security was not in his ability to fight or in his military strategy, but in the certainty that God is a faithful defender. He knew that, no matter how the adversaries prepared and armed themselves against him, God had already prepared a shield of protection. In Psalm 35, David also mentions divine intervention, where he calls for God to contend for him, like a warrior fighting for his people. This metaphor of God as a warrior is central to David's trust. He was not facing the battles alone. God was by his side, ready to fight with him and for him. David's declaration of faith teaches us a valuable lesson on how we should face life's challenges. When we are confronted with difficulties, whether in our personal, professional, or spiritual life, we often feel like we are being attacked from all sides. The weapons formed against us may come in many forms: criticism, injustices, gossip, financial crises, or even illness. The feeling of being targeted can leave us vulnerable and fearful. However, David's example shows us that, even in the face of these adversities, we should confidently declare, "No weapon forged against me will prosper." This confidence is not blind or superficial, but a trust based on an intimate relationship with God, a relationship of dependence, where we know He is with us in every situation. For David, this trust was nourished by past experiences of deliverance and victories that God had provided him. He knew from his own history that God had not abandoned him in previous battles, and therefore, he could trust that He would be with him in future battles. Moreover, this trust doesn't mean that the struggles will disappear or that life will be easy. David never promised a path without difficulties, but rather a path where, with God by our side, we can be sure that nothing will be stronger than His protective hand. As he described, God is a shield for those who trust in Him, and it is this shield that gives us the strength to keep fighting, even when the enemies seem stronger than us. By declaring that no weapon forged against him would prosper, David invites us to do the same in our own lives. He teaches us that, no matter how difficulties arise, our faith must be anchored in God, because He is our fortress, our refuge, and our strength. Just like David, we can confidently declare, "No weapon forged against me will prosper," knowing that, in every battle of life, God goes ahead of us, fighting our wars and granting us victory. In summary, David's declaration is a testimony of faith and trust in a God who will never abandon us. He is our defender, our protector, and nothing in this world can separate us from His love and care. Therefore, as we face our own battles, we can remember David's words and declare with confidence, "No weapon forged against me will prosper, because God is with us, and in His strength we find victory." And now, we have come to the end of another journey of faith together. Did you notice how powerful Psalm 35 is? Every word, every prayer of David reminds us of how faithful God is, how He fights for us, and how He never leaves us alone. Even in the most difficult moments, when the world seems to be against us, God is always by our side, ready to defend us and grant us victory. Perhaps you have faced difficulties, moments of doubt, or even felt lost in some situations. But just like David, you can trust that God is working on your behalf. He is our shield, our strength, and our warrior. When we surrender our struggles to Him, we can be sure He will take care of every detail of our lives. I want you to leave this video with the assurance that, no matter what happens, God is in control of everything. He knows your struggles, and He has already prepared the victory for you. Believe that. If you are going through a tough time right now, remember, God will give you strength, He will protect you, and He will deliver you. He always acts in our favor. Now, I want to make a very special invitation to you. If you were touched by this message and believe in the power of prayer, share this video with someone who needs to hear these words. Who knows, this message might be exactly what that person needs to move forward with more faith and trust in God. Let's spread this hope together. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't waste any more time. Click the subscribe button now so you won't miss any more videos full of faith, prayer, and spiritual strength. Don't forget to leave your amen in the comments, because I really want to know how God has been working in your life. And, of course, like the video if it touched your heart. Let's continue walking together in prayer, always seeking more peace, more victory, and more love from God. Before I close, I want to remind you that you can strengthen your faith and find a daily path of connection with God through my book, Prayers from the Psalms. It's filled with powerful prayers and reflections that will help you face challenges with more confidence and spiritual peace. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Click the pinned link in the first comment and grab your copy before it's taken down. This could be the first step toward a spiritual transformation in your life. I will be here, praying for you. Remember, you are never alone. God is with you. Until the next video, and may God's peace be with you now and always.